Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, I don't know. Anyway, my name is Olga Viberg. I'm Assistant Professor Media Technology, part of Technology Enhanced Learning Group at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And I'm going to present today our work on self-regulated learning, learning analytics, online learning environments, review empirical research conducted together with two colleagues of mine. Mohammed Halil, University of Bergen, Norway, and Martin Bars, Erasmus University of Rotterdam in Netherlands. Self-regulated learning can predict academic performance, yet it's difficult for learners, and the ability to self-regulate learning becomes even more important in emerging online learning settings. To support learners in developing their self-regulated learning analytics, which can improve learning practice by transforming the ways we support learning, is critical. So this scoping review is based on analysis of 54 papers on LA empirical research published between 2011 and 2019. I'm going to structure my presentation according to the following points. So I'm going to introduce a bit to self-regulated learning and learning analytics. I'm going to present the research question we posed, methodology we used, results will be presented according to the self-regulated phases targeted, learning analytics methods used to measure self-regulated learning, forms of self-regulated learning support, and learning analytics evidence to support self-regulated learning. Also, we looked at online learning environments, what types of online learning environments, and education level where such studies have been conducted. And finally, I will bring some discussion and conclusion. So self-regulated learning refers to the process whereby students activate and sustain cognitions, affects, and behaviors that are systematically oriented towards the attainment of personal goals. And usually when we talk about self-regulated learning, we are talking about learners' use of self-regulated learning strategies such as help-seeking, effort regulation, or time management. We also talk about responsiveness of self-oriented feedback. And their interconnected motivational processes. In this study, we have selected the model of self-regulated learning suggested by Zimmerman, which is based on social cognitive view of self-regulated learning that involves three classes of influence on self-regulated learning behavior, which are personal, behavioral, and environmental. So in this model, students start with the forethought phase in which they make plans, they set goals, and they analyze the task they are planning to work on. For example, a student plans to spend a certain amount of time on studying to reach a goal. And in the performance phase, students monitor their performance. They employ strategies and they control their learning process. That is, the student could monitor whether the studying activities and strategies that he or she has undertaken are effective in terms of the goals that were set up in the first phase. So based on the monitoring process during studying in the performance phase, the student could decide to spend more time or use different types of learning strategies, or probably to stop studying to control, because the goals probably are already reached. And the last important phase is the reflection, in which students evaluate their learning process. The student might reflect on all the steps that were taken in order to improve the next study session on some of them. So in Zimmerman's model, like in some other models, which are presented in an overview paper by Panadero from 2017, monitoring and reflection can be seen as a key self-regulated learning process, because if monitoring and or reflection are not done accurately, control and regulation of further learning will not be successful. However, studies on learning from text and also learning to solve problems have shown that students are generally inaccurate when monitoring their learning without any additional support. Hence, it becomes important to examine how students monitor their learning and how we can support them in that process. So self-regulated learning, which is associated with learning and academic achievement, is a skill that can guide learners' future paths to study and also to work. It can also be trained. It can be taught and learned. It's a transferable skill which is needed for learners in their lifelong learning for their other types of learning activities. Even though self-regulated learning used to be regarded somewhat stable across learning situations, study found that students' use of self-regulated learning differed by learning environment, physical versus online. And recent advances in the field of LH have shown that different learning analytics approaches with the aim to understand the different aspects of student self-regulated learning behavior in online learning settings can be used to measure and support student learning. So in this review, we particularly focus on investigate the application to measure and support students in online learning settings. So what happens in online learning settings? Learners struggle in online learning environments that they do not use critical self-regulated learning strategy. You can see a picture from a study that we have conducted in the Swedish school for a couple of months ago. So they do have a lot of online resources. They do have a lot of information, and they actually struggle to keep focused and be more self-regulated, self-oriented. Teacher presence is often low. There are always big classes. Students need effective self-regulated learning to be successful, which means that we need additional support for students to become more successful in online environments through the development of the SRL. Today, online learning settings provide an increased access to new types of learning behavioral and also process data, which we all know. So far, we have largely measured and supported self-regulated learning through subjective assessment, and we look at self-regulated learning as some kind of static learning ability as a product. So we looked at SRL as an aptitude through, for example, self-reported questionnaires and also interviews. We looked at self-regulated learning as an event, where we use different types of methods like think aloud methods, and also methods that detect errors, and also measures for observation of implementation of the task. However, we know that learners' ability to self-regulate himself or herself, or to use self-regulated learning strategies, is not static. It changes throughout the learning process. And researchers recognize the potential advantages of learning analytics as a means to examine students and also to support it. So we now have access to data from learning management system, massive online open courses, personal learning environments, different types of learning environments, and such data have been recommended as observable indicators to support valid inferences about learner metacognitive monitoring and metacognitive control that constitute self-regulated learning. Everyone has seen this, but I will still point out that learning analytics is not about understanding, it's also about optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. And this is even important for self-regulated learning. So it's not about only to understand what they do, but also how we can optimize their self-regulated learning in online learning settings. So why learning analytics for SRL? For learners, it can offer opportunities to exercise self-regulated learning, for researchers to collect and measure and report data about learning, and for teachers to help students to develop their self-regulated learning. So students teachers appreciate better understanding of learning behaviors. They also appreciate timely feedback and intervention. They appreciate personal assistance and information that facilitates independent learning. In terms of understanding learning analytics, we have used the 4 validated propositions such as the Viberg, Ferguson, Ducklow that suggest that LA should improve learning outcomes, should improve learning support and teaching, should be taken up widely to be scalable, in other words, and also used in ethical way. Also, LA can offer different perspective on learning in context without interference on different levels, on micro level, with the purpose for individual personalization, meso level, class level, and micro level. SRL additionally requires feedback during the learning process to monitor progress and position, to adjust self-regulated learning strategies, to identify and acquire successful learning strategies, to plan learning steps, and also to keep focused, to compare with others, and additionally to motivate himself or herself. According to Vinny, learning analytics for self-regulated learning have 2 elements: a calculation, which is based on traces of action carried out during study or learning activities, and also a recommendation, what should be changed about how learning is carried out, and instructions about how to go about changing it. Even though research on LA to support SRL is still emerging, it has just recently started to form its own domain. It increasingly recognizing the potential advantages of learning analytics, as we say. However, scholars have already raised up some critical issues which refer to what to trace about SRL, because there are so many different aspects of it. What are the attributes of instrumentation for gathering data, when to schedule, deliver LA, and forms of information to communicate in learning analytics to support effective SRL. So the overall research question that we have targeted in this scoping review is, what is the current state of the application of learning analytics to measure and support student self-regulated learning in online learning environments? So we looked at self-regulated learning phases. We looked at the learning analytics method that have been used to measure student self-regulated learning. We also looked at different types of support that have been offered to the students or to the learners. In terms of the evidence of learning analytics, we looked at whether the application of OLA to support student self-regulated learning improve their learning outcomes, whether they improve learning support and teaching, and we also look how scalable this study, how widely they were employed, and also in what type of learning environments have LA been applied to measure and support the setup. So these questions I'm going to try to answer now. So we approached this review with the scoping review methodology, and we firstly searching for publication two key databases, Scopus and Web of Science. We also looked at proceedings of the conferences. We specifically go through manually through all the led proceedings, and we also did the manual search in the leading journals. We included only empirical research articles published in scientific journals or conference proceedings, only in English, which can be seen as a limitation since we have studies published in other languages as well. Articles that present relevant research conducted in both education and non-education learning settings like workplace learning. And also for the conference, we have excluded workshop papers, so we looked only at the main conference proceedings. We also excluded review conceptual or theoretical articles that focus on the various aspects of learning analytics for self-regulated learning. So how did we do the analysis? We applied the lenses of Zimmerman's model that I have presented earlier to understand the self-regulated learning phases. To understand and code method used, we used the Mercer's categorization of methods, which includes different types of categories such as distillation of data for human judgment, prediction, clustering, relationship mining, and discovery with models. We apply the 4 validated propositions for learning analytics to understand the evidence of learning analytics for self-regulated learning, and we also looked at the different types of education level, like higher education, secondary education, and also workplace learning. So what are the results? In this review, we've ended up with 54 papers that were finally included in this study. Most of them have been so far conducted in 2016. However, 2019, we did only search until March. So, and I have seen a lot of new papers coming out, so I guess that 2019 will be a topping up and additional review is needed. So for the 2019, we did only search for 3 months. In terms of the self-regulated learning phases, we have seen, or we have found out, that most studies focused on SRL parts from the forethought and performance phase, but much less focus on reflection. We found that 43% of all the studies examined self-regulated learning as one general concept, frequently covering all phases of a SRL model, for example, by examining the students' self-regulated learning activities in relation to provided diagnostic course data during an introductory programming course in one study. About 37% of the studies focus on SRL activities from the forethought phase. Among them, 6 investigated goals as a part of self-regulated process. 4 or 7% examined time management. In one study, for example, Taboyanka used a mobile app to help students manage their learning time. And only 3 studies, 5%, were focused on motivation as a part of forethought phase. When looking at the studies in the performance phase in self-regulated learning, 9 studies, or 70% of them, investigated self-regulated learning behaviors and activities such as solving exercises. These studies examined characteristics that were not explicitly labeled as self-regulated learning in general, but, for example, measures of being an active learner in an environment such as MOOC. 22% of them examined strategies that could be either more cognitive, such as learning strategies, as more metacognitive, such as using a tool for students or teachers to monitor learning process. We found only 3 studies focused on evaluation and 2 studies focused on reflection. Overall, there is a wide spread, but as we see, much less done on the reflection. In terms of measurement support, we found out that LA research was so far conducted largely to measure with the 59% of all the studies rather than to support self-regulated learning. Many of these papers deliberate future potential without action and optimization. And the most frequently used method to support self-regulated learning is visualization by 20%. The majority of the paper within the visualization use dashboard to raise learner awareness. Other types of representation of visualization is infographic figures following the feedback. Some studies, like done by Maren Schaffer and also Dimitri, use written feedback to provide prompts to learners to reflect on their learning experiences. At last, recommendations were used in a couple of studies as well. Following the Mercen's categorization, our results show that distillation of data for human judgment was the most often LA used methods to measure student self-regulated learning, with 52% of all the studies. The second most frequent LA method is relationship mining, and studies included, for example, transition graphs and social network analysis to analyze trace data and create self-regulated learning interventions. For more concrete examples, you can take a look in our paper. There are a number of different examples and illustrations of these. In terms of not using LA method directly and using mixed type of LA with other self-reported surveys and questionnaire means, we listed them under the others category, which the third most used measurement type. Clustering with 17% and prediction were used in 9 and respectively 7 papers. So now I'm going to talk a bit about what is the evidence of learning analytics for LA. So we applied the lenses of these 4 validated propositions. And we can see what? We can see that the findings reveal that only 20% of all the reviewed papers showed that evidence that learning analytics can improve learning outcomes. Most studies in our sample didn't even assess. So you can see that 70% of all the study they didn't assess any type of learning of improvements in learning outcomes. And this also supports that the focus of LA research has been on the measurement so far on different parts of it rather than on its support. However, in these 20% of the found improvements, we could find improvements in learner grades and also development of some targeted skills such as time management skills and goal setting skills linked to their academic performance. In regard to the second proposition of learning analytics should improve learning support and teaching, we also find quite little evidence so far. We found that only 22% of all the studies could support this proposition, and our example exhibits more evidence on supporting learners rather than teachers. So learners were supported in 80% of the studies, 18, and 4 for teachers. Still, the potential for learner support and teaching either separately or in a combination has been discussed and highlighted somehow in most of the studies. And there is some small part that didn't even access or discuss this. The identified evidence for supporting learning is often associated with the use of various web-based visualization tools, including learner-centered learning dashboards, intelligent tutoring system, and bulletins with feedback to support self-regulated learning. The LA evidence for teaching support is rarely reported, and we found only a couple of relevant studies that have done that. One of them is Toten, who presented insights into the introduction of e-textbook learning platform that generated a range of data analytics that provided teachers with understanding of how their students interact with their learning materials. And also we found a study conducted by Parder, who found a positive student experience of self-efficacy, task and motivation, self-regulation, and positive interaction with several online events. We also found that learning analytics for self-regulated learning have so far not been employed widely. So most of the studies have been conducted in a short period of time with a small amount of participants. And also 50% of the study explicitly discuss ethics and privacy, which also poses some questions about what should we do in this regard. In terms of different types of education level, we can see that 70% of the studies in our sample were conducted in higher education, including people sampled from undergrads, postgraduates, and also PhD students. Very few studies, only 4% were conducted in K12 education and also in workplace learning, as you can see. Regarding the learning environment in which studies were conducted, the majority were conducted in different types of virtual learning environments, multimodal classes, ebook platforms, but also with 20% within the in-learning management system and massive online open courses. So what are the conclusions based on what we have seen, what we have examined? LA, yes, can improve learning and teaching, yet the results show that overall there is only few empirical studies on supporting learning so far. The majority of reviewed research has used LA to analyze data. Considering the fact that LA for SELECT consists of two elements, calculation and the recommendation, the second part is largely so far lacking. We also have seen that little evidence in terms of proven learner support in teaching, with the prevailing for supporting learners rather than teachers. However, we know that self-regulated learning can be taught, so which means that we also need to support teaching in teaching SRL strategies and skills. The findings also show that the variety of the illustrated SRL support is bounded, and the prevailing part of the existing support is presented in a form of web-based central learning dashboards, which also suggests that we probably need to develop other types of support. For example, we should use learners' mobile technologies, which will bring learning, bring the access to learner data across different types of formal and informal learning set, and give access to student behavioral data, which will make us better to understand SRL as a continuous process rather than a static product. We also need more studies on reflection activities in online learning settings. This is one of the key parts of self-regulated learning cycle that we have presented earlier. And as monitoring control are central for successful self-regulated learning, it's crucial to have studies on how students monitor their learning in online learning settings, and also how learning analytics can support monitoring processes and how improved monitoring is related to control process in online learning environments. We also need more studies in K12 education. We have already some studies, for example, conducted by Inge Moliner, but we need even more, and considering the fact that pervasive utilization of K12 education is considerably high now compared to higher education, we should support such learners already at this stage. We also need a bit more studies on workplace learning, and we also need some kind of work with the edtech industry for help them to design effective LA-based SRL support mechanisms. So all in all, learning analytics research was performed mainly to measure rather than to support SRL among learners in online learning environments so far. And there is a critical need to explore the LA support mechanism further to be able to ultimately use them to foster self-regulated learning among learners. So thank you so much, and I'm open for the questions.